Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Do you know what haunts a person the most? It's not the words they never heard. It's the silence they never expected. We often assume that harsh words go the deepest, but more often, what lingers and torments is not what was said, but what never arrived. A silence, sudden and unexplained, pierces deeper than any quarrel ever could. They thought you'd always be there, always forgiving, always trying, always coming back like before. But this time, you said nothing. No reaction, no pleading, no need for explanation. And in that moment, everything began to shift. Silence is no longer a sign of weakness. It marks a turning point. It is the conscious choice of someone who no longer wastes energy on what is unworthy. And to those who once held sway over you through emotion, that silence is the one fear they cannot confront. When there is no one left to blame, they are left with themselves. And within that silence, they find only questions, unease, and unspoken regret. That silence becomes the voice that echoes the loudest. 1. Silence, the supreme act of self-mastery. In the modern world, where reaction feels almost like reflex, choosing silence is no easy task. We are often urged to speak up, to assert our views, to say something, lest we be seen as weak. But to a Stoic, silence is not submission or evasion. It is a conscious act, a deliberate choice reflecting the highest level of self-control and emotional discipline. To the Stoic, composure is not innate. It is cultivated through constant training. They know that emotions cannot be fully controlled, but responses to them are entirely within our grasp. Silence, in this light, is the refusal to be dragged into futile conversations, needless conflict, or to use words as weapons of defense or attack when emotions are flaring. When someone hurts us, the instinct is to strike back, with words, with tone, with action. But the Stoic pauses is not because they don't feel pain, but because they know that reacting in anger is simply surrendering control to someone else. In that moment, silence becomes their shield, not as punishment, but as a way to guard their inner stability. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "When offended, ask yourself, does this truly steal my peace? If not, let it pass." This is the essence of Stoic thought. Violence doesn't stem from coldness, but from clarity, knowing your worth, and that you owe no one proof of it. The Stoic seeks no victory in the argument. They need no final word to feel justified. For them, the highest triumph is not silencing others, but not being pulled into a conflict unworthy of their attention. They understand that while words can reveal wisdom, they just as easily expose weakness when uttered in a state of emotional turmoil. In Stoicism, silence is not emptiness. It is the space needed for reflection, not reaction. Within that space, one can observe emotions rising without becoming one with them. We may feel anger, pain, disappointment, but we don't let those emotions govern our actions. This is the clearest expression of self-mastery. At times, silence becomes a mirror for the other. When there is no response from us, they cannot rely on our reactions to fuel their emotional games. They are left to face their own choices, their own motives. This is not manipulation. It is the creation of a necessary distance, allowing each person to own their part. The Stoic understands that speech is a tool, and no tool should be wielded carelessly. They don't speak just to feel lighter or to make a point. Every word must serve a higher aim: clarity, truth, and virtue. If a situation does not require verbal intervention, they choose silence to uphold their dignity. Silence also breaks the cycle of reaction, where bitterness is volleyed back and forth like invisible arrows. One comment can trigger a chain of negativity, leading to wounds deeper than the original offense. The Stoic refuses entry into that space. They end it at the outset, he said. With silence, a core tenet of this philosophy, no one can steal your peace unless you hand it over. Silence is the act of reclaiming that peace. When we don't respond, don't defend, don't try to control through words, we return to the center of our lives, and only then are we truly free. Undeniably, silence demands immense inner strength because human instinct is to react, to set things straight. But the Stoics rise above that instinct. They train themselves to know when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Silence is not passivity, it is disciplined action, a conscious refusal to engage in what is unworthy, a deliberate conservation of energy for what matters more, a choice to keep a cool head amidst emotional storms. And so, this silence is not weakness. It is a unique form of power not derived from controlling others, but from mastering oneself. 2. Silence, a mirror, reflecting another's insecurity. In human relationships, response is an essential part of interaction. When one acts and the other reacts, a cycle of dialogue and emotion is formed. But when one chooses silence, that familiar structure collapses. No reaction, no response, nothing to hold on to. And that forces the other person to confront the void they've always avoided themselves. From a Stoic perspective, silence is not simply the absence of speech, but a conscious withdrawal from the cycle of negative reactivity. A Stoic does not use silence to manipulate or control, but to draw a clear boundary. The line between what one governs and what one revoices is to be drawn into, and that boundary, though wordless, often reveals the other's true nature in its rawest form. When no response comes, the expectations and assumptions of the other begin to crumble. They anticipated anger, disappointment, because that is familiar. Those reactions, however negative, still give them a sense of control, a place in the narrative. But faced with complete silence, they lose their footing. They are forced to confront questions once drowned in the noise of argument. What did I do wrong? Why did they walk away? Does this silence mean it's truly over? In this sense, silence becomes a mirror that distorts nothing, only reflects what exists in the other's mind. And for many, the image they see in that mirror is deeply unsettling. It might reveal selfishness, habits of manipulation, or the harm they have caused but never acknowledged. As long as someone reacted, they could shift blame, make excuses, twist the narrative. But silence removes all intermediaries and forces them inward. For the Stoic, silence isn't intended to make the other feel bad. They choose silence to preserve their own peace. Yet that very act becomes an unspoken touch on the insecurity of the other, because when nothing remains to cling to, people begin to hear the sound within, the voice of guilt and fear, especially in relationships marked by emotional manipulation. Silence is a vacuum that upends everything. If once the other could steer the story to suit themselves, provoke predictable reactions, now they face emptiness. No words to extract, no emotions to exploit. They no longer know what the other is thinking, feeling, whether they are still hurting or have already moved on. That uncertainty creates a shadow, a space where the ego begins to tremble. In that shadow, one of the most evident things is the collapse of the illusion of control. Many don't realize they operate through subtle control in relationships. They rely on others' responses to adjust their behavior, to measure their own influence. But when silence enters, that entire measurement system fails. No signals, no feedback. The loss of control breeds confusion, anxiety, and sometimes panic. Not because silence is wrong, but because they no longer steer the narrative. On a deeper level, silence awakens memories the other tried to bury. Without back and forth, Without confrontation, the mind revisits what once was. Moments of harm inflicted, pain caused, never fully acknowledged. In silence, everything becomes clearer. No voice to distract, no debate to conceal, only the raw truth and the growing sense of regret. Thus, silence does not wound by inflicting pain. It wounds by revealing truth. And for many, truth is the hardest thing to face. It doesn't come with accusation, nor with confrontation, but through the absence of everything familiar. And in that absence, a space is opened for truth to enter. For the Stoic, making others face themselves is not the goal, but it is the natural consequence of upholding one's own principles. They do not use silence to retaliate, nor do they shield others from feeling the weight of their actions. Sometimes, the absence of a response is the only way to end a cycle of harm, because every word might only serve to prolong the pain, and in the end, the clearest truth silence brings is this: it leaves the other with no option but to look inward. They can no longer control, no longer manipulate, no longer provoke the reaction they seek. They are left with one question alone: who am I when no one remains? 3. Each moment of silence is a rebirth of the self. In relationships, a person's image in another's mind is constantly shaped through repeated interactions, words, actions, and the way we respond in different situations all contribute to constructing a version of ourselves in their eyes. When we react as we always have, they come to define us through a fixed pattern. But when we stop reacting, especially when we choose silence, a void is created, and within that void, the image of us begins to shift. The Stoic understands that controlling another's perception is beyond reach, but they grasp something deeper. Every act, or lack of it, still sends a message. Silence, though absent of words, carries the weight of transformation. It is not avoidance, but an unspoken declaration: I am no longer who I was. When someone accustomed to your consistent responses, your willingness to yield, to reconnect, suddenly finds you still, they are forced to ask, do I even know this person anymore? That change fractures the old image, the assumptions about how you'll respond, the expectations that you'll return, explain, or soothe, all begin to lose meaning. Silence opens up an inner space no longer dependent on others for identity. When we cease striving to be understood, to please, or to be right, we begin the return to ourselves. And in that process, a new self-image takes shape, not through the lens of others, but through internal awareness. This image is not formed in opposition to the past, but as a transcendence of it. Perhaps we once forgave too quickly, yielded for peace, or suppressed our needs out of fear of losing someone. But today's silence is not a continuation of that old self. It is the beginning of one being remade, a self no longer driven by the need for acceptance. From a Stoic viewpoint, this is the embodiment of the principle: do not anchor your sense of self to what lies beyond your control. When others' perceptions no longer define us, silence becomes a free choice and a decisive step in reclaiming one's own value. To someone who once knew us closely, this new image can be unsettling. They may have seen us as the one who always comes back, the one who can't walk away, the one who's easy to read. But as silence stretches, those definitions lose their grip. Each day without a response, they are left to fill the silence with speculation. And within that space, their image of us reshapes itself piece by piece. They may begin to imagine that we're at peace, happy, living a life that no longer includes them. They'll be forced to ask, do I still matter to this person? And sometimes that question stings more than any reproach ever could. Unlike loud gestures meant to provoke, silence doesn't spark resistance. It unsettles the inner world of those who believe they knew us. With no data left to predict us, they enter a state of ambiguity. And within that ambiguity, they must confront the possibility that we've entered a new chapter, one in which they no longer have a role. A Stoic doesn't stay silent to manipulate, but neither do they shield others from the natural consequences of a change. When someone is silent, not out of anger, but because they no longer seek to be understood, the nature of the relationship inevitably shifts. All previous emotional power structures dissolve. What once seemed fragile now appears composed, distant, and dignified. The reconstruction of self through silence happens quietly, but it carries enduring strength. It doesn't beg to be seen. It requires no recognition. This change unfolds inwardly, but its effects are visible in the eyes of those who once knew a different version of us. And what unsettles them most is not the silence, but the reason behind it. Have they truly changed? In Stoic thought, one is only truly free when no longer dependent on how others see them. In that sense, silence is a clear sign of inner transformation. It's the outcome of cutting off the need to explain, to be understood, or to be affirmed from the outside. Because once we reach self-mastery, we no longer define ourselves through anyone else's gaze. And so, each moment of silence is not just a pause, it's a step further from the shadow of our past self. It is a quiet redefinition, not through argument, but through absence, not by persuasion, but by a silent presence forged in strength. The new image in another's mind isn't created by our intention, but by the end of our repetition. We no longer react the same. We're no longer where we used to be, and that, precisely that, forces them to rewrite the way they see us. 4. Remaining silent is the bravest act when the heart is still in pain. There's a simple truth we often overlook. When the heart is bleeding, reacting is the easiest thing to do. In the midst of pain, we seek to be heard, to be understood, to find explanations as a means of healing or proving our worth. Yet in that very moment of intense emotion, choosing silence becomes one of the most difficult and noble trials. From a Stoic perspective, holding one's silence is not an act of emotional suppression, but a deliberate discipline, controlling response, rather than letting emotion dictate behavior. A Stoic does not deny pain, nor pretend it doesn't exist. They simply understand that pain cannot be used as an excuse to lose themselves. Amid the emotional storm, they choose silence, not because they don't know how to respond, but because they know how they must. In turbulent relationships, emotional reactions often lead to lasting consequences. A single word spoken in pain can create a fracture that won't heal. A tearful message might be dismissed or exploited. The Stoic understands that reacting before the mind has regained its clarity is a way of surrendering power to others. Therefore, they choose silence not to punish, but to protect themselves from poor decisions made under emotional pressure. Silence in the midst of pain is not a sign of coldness. On the contrary, it reveals a wound deep enough to hurt, yet a person committed enough to dignity to refuse pity. Those in pain often long to be seen, to have their pain acknowledged. But to the Stoic, pain must first be processed internally before being shared outwardly. They choose journaling over messaging, breathing over arguing, rebuilding the self over trying to fix another. In this context, silence is not indifference, but a disciplined response to personal emotion. They accept the pain, resist neither its presence nor its intensity, but refuse to let it spill outward without measure. This demands courage, to face suffering without a place to unload it. The less they react, the more they are driven inward to find their own answers. In the journey of healing, silence creates the space to observe and understand oneself more deeply. Without the drain of exhausting conversations, The Stoic can hear the inner voice, the one asking the real questions. Why am I hurting? What was I hoping for in this relationship? Is my worth truly dependent on someone else's validation? These are not easy questions, but they only arise in the stillness of silence. In a world that encourages the expression of emotion, silence is often misunderstood as avoidance or apathy. But the Stoic does not act based on how others interpret their silence. They act according to principle. And one of the most vital principles in this philosophy is self-control is the root of strength. Remaining silent while the heart is still wounded is also the first step toward withdrawing energy from the relationship that caused harm and redirecting it inward to rebuild the self, rather than waste time guessing what the other person is thinking or trying to make them feel guilt. The Stoic uses that time to recover, mentally and physically. They train, they learn, they heal quietly without needing to report their progress to anyone. The courage in silence is most evident in the restraint from seeking validation. It's not easy to sit with pain without reaching out to the one who caused it, hoping for an apology or at least a response. But the Stoic understands that the greatest trap after pain isn't the pain itself. It's the dependence on another's reaction for healing. Silence is the refusal to step into that trap. They choose to walk through the pain without waiting for permission. They don't wait for someone else to acknowledge their feelings before beginning to heal. They start within, with patience and a quiet commitment to themselves. In many cases, this silence unsettles the other person. They were used to someone who always spoke up, always explained, always tried to salvage the relationship. But this new silence, neither strategic nor attention-seeking, is the clearest signal of profound change. Without a single word, the other person realizes you are no longer who you were. The Stoic does not wield silence as a weapon, but neither do they shy away from the consequences it brings, because silence, when the heart is still hurting, is not passive withdrawal. It is an internal declaration. I take responsibility for my pain, and I will not let anyone else define how I move through it. 5. They thought you were waiting, but you were growing. When someone abruptly withdraws from a relationship or an emotionally charged situation without explanation, that act is often misunderstood. The one left behind assumes it's only a temporary silence, that the other is upset, testing them, or waiting for an apology. That silence, in their eyes, becomes a sign of hope, a quiet form of waiting they believe will soon pass. However, a Stoic does not choose silence to create drama. They don't go quiet to make others chase them or to provoke guilt. That silence, in their worldview, is the beginning of growth, no longer a reaction, but a restructuring of the inner self, no longer a tactic, but an evolution. The greatest difference between one who is waiting and one who is growing lies in where they place their attention. The one who waits is constantly outward focused, watching for messages, for signs, for any chance to reconnect. But the one who is growing does the opposite. They turn inward. They no longer care what the other is doing, thinking, or planning. Their only concern now is, what must I do to become stronger? In silence, the Stoic begins rebuilding without needing attention from anyone else. No cryptic posts, no sad status updates, no predictable emotional cues for others to read. Instead, they spend time learning, training, and reordering the internal value system that was once shaken by that relationship. What makes others mistake your silence for waiting is that it lacks clear signals. There's no anger, no resistance, no formal message of closure. But this very quietness is the clearest indicator of transformation. No more fighting means no more dependence. No more explaining means you've outgrown the need to be understood. To someone used to your constant presence, your readiness to listen or respond, your quiet disappearance feels like an unfillable void. They may imagine you are still thinking about them, that you haven't truly let go. But while they busy themselves with stories about your return, you've already stepped into a new chapter, one where they are no longer central. The Stoic does not seek validation from those who caused their pain, nor do they see forgiveness or reunion as the ultimate goal. Their aim is to rebuild the inner self on a single principle. Focus only on what is within your control. And true growth only occurs when they completely let go of the desire to control others' emotions, actions, or perceptions. This growth contains no grand moments, no applause, no stage. Everything unfolds quietly, in morning decisions to exercise rather than lie in sadness, in reading a page of a book instead of checking social media to see what the other is doing. Each small choice, repeated over time, gradually shapes a new version of the self, more stable, more composed, more self-directed. During that time, self-worth is slowly restored. If before, the other person was the yardstick by which you measured your value, now that measure has turned inward. You no longer need someone to affirm you are enough to remain in their life. You begin to realize that your existence depends on no one, and that realization becomes the turning point in your growth. To the one watching from afar, this may be condoning. They still believe your silence is meant to make them feel your absence. They think you're playing a game, but what they don't see is that you no longer stand where you once did. While they wait for a message or sign of return, you are undergoing irreversible change, like a snake shedding its skin, never to crawl back into the old one. Growth requires no announcement. The Stoic feels no need to declare a new chapter. They simply move forward, and that, more than anything, forces the other person to face the most painful truth. The one who once needed them no longer does. No more long messages, no more efforts to reconnect, not even expectations. The longer the silence lasts, the more your image is redefined in their mind. They are no longer sure who you are. Traits they once thought defined you, neediness, dependence, fragility, begin to fade, and what remains is an unknowable distance. They begin to understand you're not waiting anymore. You've moved on, and that truth leaves them with a sense of loss deeper than any spoken goodbye. 6. No need for revenge. Growth is the ultimate response. In moments of betrayal, hurt, or disrespect, the desire for revenge is deeply human. It comes as a reflex, a way to regain balance after being pushed into a position of weakness. We want to give back what we received as proof that we are not fragile, not easily wounded. But to the Stoic, revenge is not a path to peace. It's a sign the mind is still held hostage by another. Stoicism does not deny the reality of pain, nor does it reject the legitimacy of the difficult emotions. But the philosophy centers on mastering the self, not controlling others. Revenge in any form, sharp words, retaliatory acts, subtle manipulation, is a reaction still governed by emotion. It grants continued power to the one who caused the harm, the power to shape our actions and emotions, even in their absence. By contrast, quiet, steady, and unpublicized growth is a far more potent reply than any act of retaliation. When someone doesn't react as expected, but instead transforms and evolves, that change becomes a clear message. I'm no longer where you left me. The old rules no longer apply, because the playing field has changed, and the person they once thought they could control is no longer the same version of themselves. From the perspective of the one who inflicted harm, such silent growth can create a deeper sense of loss than outright defiance. Because if someone reacts, they're still engaged, still bound. But when there's no reply, no presence left to influence, they're forced to face the truth. They've lost their grip, and the sting doesn't come from retaliation, but from becoming irrelevant. That kind of growth does not stem from a desire to win through success, because even that would imply comparison and dependence. In Stoic terms, the goal is not to surpass someone else. It's to free oneself from the need for them at all. When someone stands firm from within, they no longer require external affirmation to confirm their worth. And so, every step forward ceases to be a reaction to pain and becomes the natural rhythm of a mind that has chosen freedom. Revenge by nature is fleeting. It may offer a short-lived satisfaction, but it never leads to lasting liberation. The Stoic knows that action born of pain only produces more pain. Growth, on the other hand, shaped by time, discipline, and reflection, is the slow reconstruction of a self no longer chained to the past. One of the universal insights of this philosophy is, the best revenge is to be nothing like the one who harmed you. When others choose cruelty, rudeness, or selfishness, our instinct may be to mirror them, but doing so only makes us their reflection. The Stoic chooses another way. They refuse to let others define their conduct. Their maturity stands as living proof. I may have been hurt, but I will not become what hurt me. This doesn't mean the Stoic is blind to injustice or immune to anger. They simply don't allow those feelings to overrule their values, because for them, upholding principle outweighs winning a battle that's already lost its meaning. True growth needs no spotlight. The Stoic feels no need to prove they are better, stronger, or happier. There is no need to say, "I've moved on," because the way they live, their grounded presence, says everything. This creates a wordless reply more powerful than any declaration. When the one who caused harm sees the other person living well, steady, composed, and no longer needing their validation, they must face one fact: their influence is gone. There's nothing left to hold, nothing to control, nothing left to salvage. That realization carries a weight far greater than rejection or blame. Growth also shows itself through silent forgiveness, not because the other deserves it, but because the Stoic deserves freedom. In that process, they don't need to say the word "it's." They simply stop letting pain dictate their behavior, and that alone is the final response. No need for revenge. No need for dramatic gestures. Only the quiet truth of inner transformation. And when that happens, the other no longer sees the familiar version of you. They see someone who's stepped into a new chapter. No old roles. No old place. No more dependence. 7. Silence, where true strength is born. In a world where words are seen as tools of power, silence reveals a different kind of strength. Calm, steady, and internal. Stoicism does not deny the value of speech, but places emphasis on the ability to master oneself before reacting. And within that restraint, a quiet form of strength is forged, the power of self-control. According to Stoic philosophy, we cannot control what comes from the outside, the actions of others, unexpected events, or external circumstances. What we can control entirely is our response. In many cases, silence is the highest expression of that control. It is not a lack of reaction, but a deliberate one, a refusal to be ruled by emotion or reduced to a victim of circumstance. Silence creates space between stimulus and response. In that space, the Stoic gains the opportunity to reflect, assess, and redirect their approach to what's unfolding. Rather than respond immediately with anger or anxiety, they choose to remain silent, to regain clarity. And this delay in reaction helps preserve emotional stability, a core element In cultivating inner strength, silence also nurtures intellectual independence. When free from the pressure to say something, the Stoic can hear their inner voice more clearly. Stillness liberates them from the need for external agreement. They don't need to be right, don't need to be proven correct, don't need to win an argument. They only need to live according to the principles they have chosen. And that is the foundation of real strength. In moments of attack, criticism, or even betrayal, people are often tempted to defend themselves. But from the Stoic view, the compulsion to explain is a sign of internal instability. A person of true strength does not need to speak to affirm their value. They let their behavior, their composure, and their consistency speak for them. Clientes in this case becomes the most minimal yet most powerful expression of a dignity. Clience is also a symbol of inner freedom. When a person no longer feels the need to react to everything around them, it shows they have detached themselves from external control. They are no longer slaves to emotion or impulse. They can choose not to respond, and that choice proves they are no longer bound by expectation, assumption, or social pressure. One of the most striking features of silence in Stoicism is that it requires no audience. This strength does not demand to be witnessed or praised. The Stoic does not remain silent to be admired for their calm or maturity. They remain silent because it is the right thing to do, a pure act of self-governance. And true strength in this light is not measured by its outward impact, but by its inward steadiness amid external chaos. Silence is also the ideal condition for reflection, an essential ingredient in cultivating wisdom. When someone is constantly reacting, there is no time to observe themselves. But in silence, the Stoic examines their own behavior, motives, and values. They ask the hard questions. Why did I want to react that way? Am I living by my chosen principles? Is this emotion worthy of my response? This self-inquiry and the answers that follow form the basis for lasting development. True strength cannot come from controlling others. It can only come from mastering oneself. And the one who knows how to be silent at the right time is no longer dependent on external validation to feel worthy. They don't need to win arguments to feel strong. They don't need applause to know they're on the right path, because inner strength requires no noise. It grows in silence, enduring and deep. This is also evident in how the Stoic approaches conflict. Instead of escalating tension, they choose to stop, not because they lack reasoning, but because they understand peace is more valuable than proving they're right. In that pause, they do not let the other win. They simply refuse to participate in a game that leads nowhere. Silence here is how they preserve their integrity, rather than let confrontation erode their character. Spiritual maturity is not measured by the speed of one's reaction, but by the ability to endure discomfort without losing reason. The Stoic does not avoid emotion, but they refuse to be ruled by it. In every moment, they hold their silence in the midst of a storm. A store of inner strength is built, an underground force, quiet yet alive with power. Silence, in the end, is not the absence of speech. It is the full presence of awareness. It is the space in which one chooses deliberate action over reflex. It is where we detach from roles, from expectation, from impulsive feeling, to return to what matters: the art, dignity. We cannot control whether others hurt us, but we can absolutely control how we respond. I've been in relationships where even the longest, most heartfelt explanations changed nothing. Every time I spoke up, I felt myself sinking deeper into a cycle of pain, where the other person's silence only made me speak more, try harder, and lose myself in the process. But since encountering Stoic philosophy, I've come to understand silence is not surrender. It is an intentional act. When I stopped, no longer sending lengthy messages, no longer waiting for replies, I began to reclaim time for myself. I returned to old habits I had abandoned. Reading, exercising, journaling. It all began with one seemingly small decision: to say nothing more. And then something unexpected happened. I no longer felt angry. I no longer needed them to admit they were wrong, because through each quiet day, I gradually realized my worth was never in someone else's hands. I don't need to be understood in order to heal. I only need to grow. And that growth began the moment I chose silence. Not to wait for someone else, but to begin a new journey, the journey of mastering myself. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future videos. Silence is not an absence. It's the place where we finally meet ourselves. See you in the next video.